he's actually completing it probably within the normal range of a 5-year student, which is great, because it's a hard thing to do. It's a challenging thing to do, but he was able to pull it off. This is a new area of research for my lab. New area in the sense that we do all the nutrient stuff in the past, but we haven't really worked on your urban streams. So Brendan was actually our guinea pig. No, he was really a great worker. He got money out of Virginia Resources, Water Resource Commission, something like that, out of Virginia Tech. There's a group that oversees it. Got a nice grant from them. Got some other money given to him from the Virginia Living Museum over here. And I think, and support from our engineering department at Newport News, which is our 2 representatives over here, Joe and Mark, sitting. They were out there early on and showing us the sites. They had done a lot of restoration work. This is work that's been done. In fact, I don't know if he's going to cover it, but I'll do a quick. This is research that actually been driven by trying to clean up the bay. Okay, it's trying to clean up the urban runoff that goes into our bay and water surrounding the bay. Primarily for the water of Newport News, it's going to go to James River. But the streams that flow from our urbanized areas, they can carry a lot of pollution with them. Primarily, what we are concerned with is the nutrients that were flowing out. And I think a lot of the sediment that actually flows out too is a problem because it carries nutrients with it. But we have actually looked at the dissolved, and he'll address this in his thesis presentation, the dissolved nutrients, not just so much the particulates. But it's a hot area of research because EPA is pressing hard with the regulations on top of the cities, and of course, well, they're coming down to state first, and then it passes down from the state level down to the city level. You get the idea. So hopefully this will help clean up, and some of the assessment that he's been doing will give us some feel as to when they do restoration work, and you're going to hear about that too, these streams to try to improve the uptake of nutrients or to improve the uptake of sediments, that will actually prevent the pollution to get into the bay, which will help the bay recover from its demise. Maybe it will recover. We hope it will in maybe our lifetime. Hopefully in some of you younger people's lifetime for sure. All right, so without further ado, Brendan, you can see his title. He'll introduce it himself, but I appreciate it again for all you guys showing up. And please eat the donuts. Even if you want to grab one now before he really starts in, grab it, and then later on definitely get some more. Because we're not going to eat it as a thesis committee.
Is that a challenge?
Yeah. You wait. Go ahead.
All right, thank you all. As I said, my name is Brendan Player, and my project was on assessing the nutrient uptake and benthic macroinvertebrate community assemblages within restored and degraded reaches of urban streams here at Newport News. So just some acknowledgments, people I'd like to thank, obviously my committee, two of which members are here, Dr. Whiting and Dr. Stephen, and then again the sponsors that he mentioned, Virginia Water Resources Research Center, their graduate research grant, Christopher Newport University for their summer research grant, and then the Virginia Living Museum for the Watson Conservation Grant. Some technical assistance, obviously, from the Newport News Department of Engineering and giving us access to the sites and helping show us around. Dr. Michael Meyer for supervising the Benthic portion of this research and offering expertise. Jackie Rockmore for assisting with ordering supplies and getting me anything I needed for the research. And then obviously students Lee, Tanner, and Megan for their assistance in the field, who wouldn't have been possible doing all the field work without them. So to start off, we're going to talk about generally how nutrients are processed within streams and then move on from there. So runoff is going to carry a lot of dissolved nutrients, mainly in the form of in different nitrogen and phosphorus forms, mainly nitrate phosphate. And it's also going to carry those same nutrients in sediment and organic particulates. As they flow downstream, they work their way into these stream channels, and they flow off over different surfaces. Those dissolved nutrients can then be taken up by autotrophs, such as algae and plants located within the stream. And generally, once it enters in its inorganic form, the dissolved form, a big way that this is processed outside of being taken up by algae and plants located within the stream is also bacteria located within the sediment. And what that's known as hyperheic exchange. And so the hyperheic zone is this wetted zone right around the stream channel. This is going to be the primary area of biological activity within the sediment. it's where the stream water enters the sediment and you have some groundwater entering the stream. It's this mixing area where a lot of that bacteria is going to grow, nutrients are going to be processed. And so this is primarily where a lot of that denitrification occurs, taking up that nitrate, absorption to clays for the phosphate. And so this is how a lot of that dissolved inorganic nutrients are being sequestered within a stream. Particulates can also be leached out or sequestered physically. This is going to occur when flow velocity is lower. Particulates will fall out of the water column and be sequestered naturally and biologically at the bottom. That's primarily done through benthic macroinvertebrates, which is a big part of this project. So benthic macroinvertebrates and bacteria will break down and sequester algae, particulates, leaf litter. This is primarily through their functional feeding groups. So there's different trophic levels that benthic macroinvertebrates will feed on. This is a crane fly larva, and basically it's known as a shredder, and so it shreds up leaf material to consume. So all the organics that are entering this area and falling to the bottom, that has to then be broken down. And the way it's broken down is it's broken down to fine particular or organic matter, or it's being shredded in leaf material by this crane fly, or it is taken up by algae, and then the algae dies, falls to the bottom, and that's eaten by a lot of snails. So these different functional feeding groups are really important for taking the solid form that's holding those nutrients and sequestering it into the stream so it resides longer. A big part of this experiment is assessing nutrient spiraling. So this concept has multiple parts, but mainly we're going to be focused with the uptake portion of this model. So if you can imagine here, nutrients get added to the stream in whatever form, and they, let's just say they're dissolved form, and then they start to work their way down the water column. So this is upstream, moving downstream, the stream bed. So generally, as it works its way through, it's going to be processed, either taken up by autotrophs, or it's going to be taken up by and exchanged with the ground through that hyperheic exchange. And as you work its way down, it's going to be taken up by the system. The average length that dissolved inorganic nutrients are going to travel before being processed by the stream is known as uptake length, and that's often recorded in meters. The next part is, as it works its way down and it's being taken up, there's a rate to it. So milligrams per meter squared per unit area per minute. That's known as uptake rate. So as this works its way through, it's being taken up by different processes. And then the general velocity, the vertical velocity that this is traveling towards benthos, towards being taken up, is known as uptake velocity. That's often recorded in millimeters per minute. So these three are what we're going to assess for the purpose of this project, but I do think it's important to note that there are other processes incorporated with the nutrient spiral. That's only one part of it. So other parts of this involved are, as this works its way down to benthos, it's taken up by inorganic and inorganic particulates, and the general distance that it takes for those organic particulates to be sequestered before they're taken up by other organisms is known as particulate uptake length. Then the consumptive uptake length is the average distance that those are going to travel in their particulate form being transferred from one organism to another. So again, that's talking about those benthic macroinvertebrates and them taking up a lot of those organics and sequestering them. And then you can see this overarching arrow here. This is known as transient storage. And so this is really a true measure of sequestration of nutrients within a stream. When you have measuring transient storage is really the overall distance that these particles are traveling through benthos before re-entering the surrounding, the actual water column. When they're released, it's basically the exact opposite of uptake. So you have a release length, which is the average distance it takes for those to be released back into the water column fully. The release velocity, which is the speed at which it's being released, that's arrow. And then the release rate, again, this is per unit area, per unit time. Although a lot of the time this enters back into the water column to re-begin the spiral once again, it can also re-enter the atmosphere or floodplain during flood events. So there's other outlets. It doesn't necessarily just go right back into the stream and then begin the process again. And it is important to note that during high flow velocities, this nutrient spiraling of uptake, sequestration, and release Also makes its way onto the floodplain, often onto wetland environments located on either side of the stream, and that's going to undergo its own terrestrially driven nutrient spiral as well, before eventually working its way back in the form of runoff or particulates, organics that were taken up and then re-entered the stream environment. So all of that being said, now that we've talked about how nutrients are processed naturally within stream environments, it's important to talk about how these streams are then degraded in those processes, subsequently degraded as well. So a lot of the time in urban environments, stormwater management is incorporated into streams. We have a lot of impervious surfaces located around Newport News in the form of parking lots and roofs and roads, and the water that would otherwise penetrate the ground there then has to go someplace. And so we use stormwater management systems to avoid flooding and things of that nature, and then those waters tend to end up in naturally occurring waterways located throughout a city. In this example, also for deforestation in the form of tearing forests down, building buildings. Also, that's going to lessen the amount of vegetation, which is only going to increase the amount of water entering these environments and the amount of erosion. So this high flow velocities whenever it rains, because you have a lot more water that is not being taken up by the surrounding environment, is instead going directly into this stream, are going to shear off vegetation, erode stream banks, and remove bed sediment. So the stream will start to dig down and deepen, and then it'll also start to widen, because all of that sediment is being pushed out and the vegetation is being sheared off that's holding that sediment together. What a big problem for that, especially in urbanized environments, is property damage, because a lot of the times you have people's properties, not in this photo, but you'll have houses right here on the right, just a little bit ways away from the stream, and as this erodes further and further back, it's just encroaching on their yard. The property is disappearing every year, and so this is a big problem. So again, removal of that vegetation and sediment, but it also decreases cycling potential within those streams, and primarily this is done through lessening hyperheic exchange. So as this erodes down, you're getting into deeper, more clay soils. There's not a whole lot of surface water, groundwater exchange happening. It's hard for bacterial communities to establish themselves within the sediment, and so you end up with lower uptake rates within that stream subsequently. And in addition, channelization. So as you have this large amount of water that's flowing through, a stream that meanders is going to force more hyperheic exchange, because water is going to force its way into the sediment and then back into the stream. So when you have a stream that then has a lot of water going through it, it's going to naturally force the stream to work its way back into a straight channel rather than something that meanders. And when you have a straight channel, then you're having less of that hyperheic exchange, less uptake for that stream environment. Also increasing in terms of habitat, it increases habitat homogeneity. So a lot of the times, because you're eroding out, you're pushing out all this cobble and sediment, you're turning something that would alternate between riffle systems and runs and pools into more of a run and pool systems. And so it's generally deep waters, the types of sediment is pretty homogeneous, there's not a whole lot of variability. And also because you're not having as many of those riffle systems, because there's blowout due to those high flow velocities, you're going to end up with decreases in oxygen availability. And so that really decreases the abundance of aquatic organisms located within those stream environments as well. Primarily, this is going to decrease the benthic macroinvertebrate diversity that's found within the stream that contributes a lot to the sequestration of those nutrients and provides a baseline for a food chain within your stream environments. Also, it's going to increase so overall, all these processes summed up, it's going to increase your nutrient sediment and export downstream, and those nutrients and sediment are going to have negative effects, obviously, on downstream environments, in addition to degradation within your own stream. Downstream, it can lead to things like eutrophication, algal blooms, dead zones, things of that nature on a much larger scale. So in order to combat this, stream restoration projects that are done, as Dr. Whiting talked about at the beginning, primarily, this is focused on engineering increased channel complexity. And so this is going to be re-engineering pool, riffle, and run systems to establish more natural flow regimes. If you can imagine, also it's going to help enhance hyperheic exchange, because you have a pool system here, then a riffle, then a pool. Sometimes you'll have runs in between. And so you're managing the flow velocities within your stream environment to try to decrease erosion. As this works its way through, it's actually going to, that alternation is going to force hyperhelic exchange. And different features, like in this case, the log step here, which is basically same with like a cross vein, which is a really large rock. You plant it into the stream, and water hits it, and it trickles over the top. It's a way to, again, to control those flow velocities. It's also going to force deeper penetration of that water, causing increased hyperhelic exchange because it can't flow through the object. So a lot of these features have been researched and shown to increase the nutrient uptake within that system. In addition, a lot of those techniques are also going to trap organics and sediment within those pools, because as these flow velocities decrease, entering these pools, especially in step pools, which are an alternation between pool, rock cross vein, pool, rock cross vein, and as it flows in, all of the sediment's going to fall out into the bottom, and that's going to be hopefully sequestered biologically over time. And so it's going to help trap a lot of those organics and sediment. Increases in habitat quality can also result from these processes. Substrate particle size is a big one, because a lot of the times, you can see here, this is one of the projects that, one of the sites I studied that I'm going to talk about later. A lot of cobble is used to engineer these riffle systems, and a lot of large boulders are used to help secure stream banks to help control erosion. So this increase in substrate particle size is going to increase that oxygenation of the water, and then it's also going, it's been correlated larger substrate particle sizes within streams with increased benthic macroinvertebrate diversity as well. Vegetative planting and sediment stabilization on the banks is also going to enhance the cycling of those nutrients and increase the stabilization, especially during flood events. If you have a lot of vegetation, a lot of root systems, it's going to help hold together that sediment. And like I said, this imbricated riprap is helping to control erosion on the side of the banks. It's also aesthetically pleasing, which is good for the public. Another tactic that has not been used on any of the streams around here, any of the restorations, but during my internship at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, they used this, so I thought it was interesting to include, is undergoing soil enrichment through a fill material, often wood chips. So if you add wood chips to your fill material when you're constructing a restoration, it adds carbon to the system, which is going to stimulate microbial activity. This can have somewhat detrimental effects on the biota located within the stream, because now you're having a ton of bacterial blooms within your stream, but it's going to drastically increase the amount of cycling potential for that stream environment. Also, adding woody debris from construction can help create habitat for benthic macroinvertebrates, if that's the purpose of your project as well. And benthic macroinvertebrate populations can also be reinforced or reestablished post-restoration with products like habimats or habitudes, which conference in Maryland, they presented on this product. Basically, it's a netting that you interweave woody material within, and then you use that woody material, you plant it within a stream, and benthics will colonize it, or you can plant it within a healthy stream, have benthic macroinvertebrates colonize it, and then transport it to a recently restored stream to help reestablish populations there. So all that being said, stream restoration, stream degradation, natural nutrient cycling, the purpose of this project was to firstly, well, we're going to go over this in two parts so it makes sense, because it's essentially two projects that are somewhat connected. So firstly, we're going to talk about the purpose of this was to evaluate benthic macroinvertebrate community abundance, richness, diversity, biomass, and average weighted tolerance values within restored and degraded reaches. So a lot of those restoration techniques are, again, reestablishing alterations between pool, riffle, and run systems, increasing the amount of cobble within the system. And so the idea is that it's going to increase the amount of habitat complexity that's present there, and subsequent diversity, richness, things of that nature. So that was kind of the thought process behind that. In addition, like I said, increased substrate particle size, but also perhaps better oxygenation, because you're re-engineering a lot of those riffle systems within the stream. So that's where kind of that comes about for evaluating benthic macroinvertebrate communities. The second purpose of this project was to evaluate inorganic nutrient uptake within the restored and degraded reaches of these urban streams. And the thought process behind that was that a lot of that channel complexity is going to force more hyperhelic exchange, which might increase the amount of inorganic nutrient uptake. And then also trapping a lot of those organics and decreasing soil oxygenation might increase denitrification rates within the stream. So it's important to note that all the streams that we're going to talk about today, the primary kind of focus of the restoration techniques that were used were going to be limiting erosion and decreasing organic and sediment pollution downstream. So the purpose was it was not a project that was designed to enhance hyperheic exchange. That was not the focus. But the thought process, as I presented at the beginning, is a lot of those same features and same techniques have been indicated to have that side effect. And so this is kind of evaluating these side effects of these restoration techniques, seeing if the general restoration techniques that are designed to control erosion, trap organics, also are increasing inorganic nutrient uptake and providing habitat for benthic macroinvertebrate organisms. So the field sites that we're going to talk about today, firstly, Stony Run. This was very newly completed. This was completed in the summer. And it's a 296-meter long stream restoration, or at least that was the reach that we analyzed, and 4.96 meters wide. Every degraded reach, so often there was a restored reach, and then the degraded reach just went on, or vice versa. And so what I did is I measured out a distance that was somewhat close to the distance of the restored reach to compare against, because distance is a factor that's corrected for within the calculations, but I didn't want to compare, a degraded reach that was twice as long as the restored reach. So I tried to make them somewhat equatable to one another. And so this reach was 253 meters long, which is about as close as I can get without cutting features in half. And then 4.7 meters wide. So Highlands was the oldest of the sites. This was, the restored reach was 240 meters long and 1.95 meters wide. The degraded reach was 247 meters long and 2.79 meters wide. And so for Stony Run, completed in 2017, this is a photo of the restored reach here. And you can see lots of vegetation on either side, but you notice that there's not a whole, you can't really tell from here. There are in-stream features alternating between runs, riffles, and pools, but it's not as drastic as some of the other sites. And the reason why that is because a lot of these restoration techniques, like I said, were designed to trap organics. This particular site has a really large retention pond kind of area at the end of the stream that traps a lot of those organics and sediment. And so they didn't need to engineer a lot of that same channel complexity within the actual stream to accomplish that same effect. That retention pond was not included in the analysis because it wouldn't have been possible with the methods. So I just focused on the stream channel. So the Stony Run overall, being a brand new site and also not having as much channel complexity, is very different from the other two. Highlands, which is here, you can see the restored reach here. There's tons of vegetation. You can see some of that imbricated riprap on the other side in the form of cobble. And then this is the degraded reach. You can see a pretty big difference. I also think it's important to note with Stony Run, these banks here were about as tall as me. Really drastic erosion occurring on either side of the bank. So a really big difference between the two. Same here, a little bit of erosion on either side, and we'll talk a little bit about physically how these reaches differ. The last stream was Lucas Creek, which is 2016, so this is someplace, this is in the middle. The restored reach is 223 meters long, and again, 237 meters long for the degraded reach, and 3.03 meters wide versus 3.51 meters wide for the degraded. So the restored reach is here. You can see, again, a lot of that cobble, a lot of this vegetation on the other side, apartment complexes, and the degraded reach here, very, very different between the two. So the first thing was kind of plotting features and understanding how channel complexity, what's the degree of channel complexity for each of these streams. So features were identified visually as pool, riffle, and run systems, basically based off of depth. It's very obvious when you're looking at a pool versus a riffle versus a run. And they were flagged off to kind of mark each individual feature. Channel complexity was calculated then based on the average number of featural transitions per 100 meters. Degraded reach were then established in close to equal length to the restored reaches, as I said. And then width was measured every 10 meters, working all the way down both reaches, and then average to get an average width for the stream. So benthic macroinvertebrates were sampled using dip and kick nets across all of these sites to see which had the greatest organism abundance and family level taxonomic richness. And the idea behind that is there was another portion of this project I'm going to present on a little bit later and we didn't have the resources to do this across all the sites nor the time, and so we wanted to pick a site that we were most likely to see a lot of diversity. We didn't want to pick a site where there was 2 benthic organisms in the restored reach and 2 in the degraded and try to make something out of that. We wanted something with a good amount of diversity and richness already present, so we could look for differences there. So as a result, Lucas Creek was chosen as the site to further analyze because it had a lot of channel complexity and a lot of family richness that we were able to collect there. So going over some of these sampling techniques, as I said, this is kick net techniques. So just kicking into the net as you work your way down the feature. The samples from a whole feature. This is a dip net, and so this involves moving it across the bottom to catch organisms or kicking into it. And then this is the third, which is kind of important. This is Artificial Substrate Colony Sampler, or ASC. It's a modified Hester Dendy benthic macroinvertebrate sampler that I constructed with the help of Dr. Meyer. And so the idea is these are made of laminate flooring material, and it's rough on one side and smooth on the other. And when you plant it into a stream and secure it, benthic macroinvertebrates will then colonize, and then you can collect the organisms off of them and then redeploy if you want to. So firstly, presenting on substrate particle size, we used a Woolman pebble count to determine substrate particle sizes for 80% of each of the stream reaches. So this is basically, you go through and you walk in somewhat of a zigzag pattern, and you collect random substrate samples every meter, and you end up over 100 substrate samples over 80% of the reach, and something like that. And then you categorize them based off of size. So you measure them on 3 axes, and then depending on which axis is the largest, if it's less than 0.2, then you categorize it as sandstone or clay. If it's greater than 102.4 centimeters, then you categorize it as a large boulder, and everywhere in between. So this is generally to categorize, break up the sediment, figure out what percentages are what. So then a 6 2-meter length plots were established running down each reach. These were about 20 to 30 meters apart, and they were as wide as the stream channel. And so the idea was we were setting these up so that way we could then deploy artificial substrate colonies within them. And we used 30 random substrate samples, similar to the Woolman pebble count, were taken from each one of those plots to figure out what were the percentages of different types of substrate present within each one of those plots, which were then used for further analyses. So some of the results of that portion, just background conditions of the stream, there wasn't a huge difference, as I said, between in channel complexity, transitions per 100 meters, in Stony Run, between restored and degraded reaches. That was not the focus of the project, and so you can really see that there's about 5 and just less than 5 transitions in restored and degraded. When you compare that to Highlands, there's a much greater difference here. So you have about 18 transitions per every 100 meters. And then in the degraded reach, you have closer to 9 transitions per 100 meters. And then in Lucas Creek, the restored reach, a little bit less of a difference, but still 12 per 100 meters. And then in the degraded, about 7 per 100 meters. And so these differences in channel complexity ultimately were investigated further for increasing hyperadic exchange. So it's also important to note that this channel complexity presents itself also in featural composition. So looking at Stony Run, the restored reach was about 25% pools, 42% riffles, and 33% runs. When you compare that to the degraded, there's more pools, less riffles, and less runs. So again, focusing more on these, it's evenly divided basically between pool and riffle, and a little bit less of run. But again, it's that idea that there's less riffles in the degraded reach than the restored reach. When you look at Highlands restored, there's 38% pools, 38% riffle, and 25% run. And when you compare that to the degraded, there's now much more pools, no riffles at all, and much more runs. So it's again that degradation is forcing the channel complexity of the stream into more run and pools and less riffles. Lucas Creek, it's the same kind of story. There's 32% pools, 64% riffles, 5% runs, and again, there's 43% runs here, 43% pools, and only 14% riffles. So the composition, even if this complexity is about the same, is different between restored and degraded reaches. Looking at the substrate from the Woolman pebble count, there's also a huge difference in substrate, but not in Stony Run. This is Stony Run restored and Stony Run degraded. You can see the blue here. This is all sand, silt, and clay. So there's 59% sand, silt, and clay in the restored reach, and 65% sand, silt, and clay in the degraded reach. So there's not a huge difference. Looking at coarse gravel, which is the next largest, 23% here versus 15% here. So there, you can just see, looking at these two, that there's not a whole lot of difference in substrate. Looking at highlands, there's 37% large cobble here. There's no large cobble at all in the degraded reach. However, looking at sand, silt, and clay, there's about 30% in the restored reach, and 84% of the substrate in highlands degraded reach is sand, silt, and clay. So again, this system is primarily dominated by sand, silt, and clay, and you can tell there's not a whole lot of other types of substrate here. But there's much more substrate heterogeneity here and larger substrate particle sizes. When you look at Lucas Creek, it's the same type of story. So you have 40% large cobble, only 18% sand, silt, and clay. Medium cobble is 18%, and then here it's almost entirely dominated. It's 77% by sand, silt, and clay, and not a whole lot else. So you can just tell the differences in substrate between restored and degraded reaches. Now going a little bit into the benthic portion of the experiment and some of the methods behind that. So looking at plot width and artificial substrate colony deployment, plot width was measured, was averaged from those measurements, taken 0.5 meters within each of those plots, totaling 5 measurements, just to get a general plot width. And ASCs were then deployed in February of this year in each of those plots. So there were 3 artificial substrate colonies deployed within each plot, and 3 plots within each reach. They were marked A, B, and C, each one of the substrate colonies, and this was basically, although they were collected randomly at the end, we were just trying to get some sort of marker that indicated other physical factors that we measured with each of those plots. The distance between the top of the stream reach and each artificial substrate colony was measured, and then each colony was left for 13, 28, and 34 days before collection. Each of the colonies were transferred from the water to a plastic bag to try to minimize that loss of sample. And then each colony was then rinsed over netting to try to catch all of those benthic macroinvertebrates. And then dip and kick nets were then used 2 weeks after the last artificial substrate colonies were collected. And from 5 of the features within each reach of Lucas Creek, so 5 in restored, 5 in degraded, and 3 of which were locations of the artificial substrate colonies where they were planted. So we have some sort of relationship between the two to compare. Organisms were then preserved in 70% ethanol and identified under a microscope to the genera taxonomic level. So looking at richness, diversity, and biomass, we measured genera richness, which is the number of genera present, genera diversity, H prime through Shannon's diversity index, biomass using ash-free dry weight in grams of organic matter. And so this was measured by drying samples at 103 degrees Celsius for 4 hours, and then igniting them at 550 degrees Celsius for 1 hour and using weight differences. And just some of the organisms, this is kind of a general snapshot of some of the stuff that we saw. So this is it's predatory, it's dragonfly larva, back swimmer. This is some snails, some scuds. It's a non-biting leech, caterpillar. It's a riffle beetle. This is caddisfly larva. They're indicative of well-flowing oxygenated streams. So just some of the stuff that we were seeing in the end. Then they were divided based off of functional feeding groups, as I talked about at the beginning. So again, this was divided in categories such as shredders, which consume leaf material, collectors that are going to consume fine particulate organic material, or FPOM, which are partially decayed organic material, scrapers that are going to consume a lot of that algae, and so filters that are going to consume a lot of suspended organic material from the water, and then predators that are going to consume other benthos or benthic macroinvertebrates. So just an example, this is a shredder, crayfish, a scud is a collector, this is a mud snail, and that's a scraper that consumes algae, primarily snails or scrapers. Filters, this is a sumulid, it consumes suspended organic material from the water column and attaches to rocks, and then of course predatory dragonfly larvae. We then used all of that data and put it into indices that are often used for benthic macroinvertebrate assessments. The first one was the Hilsenhoff Biotic Index, or HBI. This is used to assess water quality and organic pollution based off of the biotic communities present within a stream. So it utilizes tolerance values of the benthos from 0 to 10. The important note is 0 means you have no tolerance to organic pollution, 10 being you have complete tolerance for organic pollution. And then using that, you can then calculate the average weighted tolerance of the community, and that's an indicator for water quality within your reach. The second one that was used that incorporates the HBI is a coastal plain macroinvertebrate index. This is a multi-metric bioassessment index that assesses biotic integrity based off of your benthos community. It scores different metrics based off in category ranges from 0, which is bad in this case, so it's the opposite of the HBI, versus 6, which is good water quality, good habitat. And those different metrics are going to be total taxa to the family level, not to the genera level. EPT taxa, which is the amount of Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera present. Those are tolerant organisms. Percentage of Ephemeroptera, your HBI, the Hilsenhoff Biotic Index, so it incorporates these indicators of tolerance for this score, and then also the percentage of clingers. This is a type of behavior, organisms that cling to hard surfaces, often associated with riffle systems. And then you also have, and then we also then use that information to assess category ranges from severe stress to excellent and everywhere in between, based off of the community. We then used all that information and put it into statistics. We used t-tests and Wilcox to look at benthic macroinvertebrate richness, abundance, diversity, and biomass between reaches, restored and degraded reaches of Luke's Creek. And then we looked at richness, abundance, diversity, and biomass, and we correlated them in Pearson's experiments correlations with physical factors, such as substrate particle size, channel width, and distance from the top of the reach, to try to find correlations. And then, of course, all data management occurred in Microsoft Excel, and all statistics were run using RStudio. So some of the results of now the benthic portion of this experiment, just looking at artificial substrate colony samplers versus dip and kick nets, there's a huge difference in general richness that we were able to capture. Using the artificial substrate colonies, we only captured 14 versus 20. With abundance, this is to be expected. We only captured 54 organisms total with the artificial substrate colonies, but 423 with dip and kick nets. This is because artificial substrate colonies are this big, and the dip and kick nets sample entire features, so a lot more organisms they were able to capture. And then also for biomass, also be expected because of abundance, 30.176 grams of organic matter versus 111 grams of organic matter. But diversity, although lower diversity, there wasn't a huge difference in diversity. And this is primarily because although there's a huge difference in the amount of organisms that we captured and the amount of genera that we captured, the dominant members of the community were captured using both methods. It was just the extra abundance of the extra genera that we weren't able to capture with the ASCs that contributed to this difference in diversity between artificial substrate colonies and dip and kick nets. Looking at the abundance, richness, and diversity in biomass, firstly, we analyzed dip and kick nets for all future analyses. That being said, so the artificial substrate colonies, because they captured less genera, less abundance, less diversity, we kind of we looked at that information, but ultimately, for the purpose of this presentation, we're just going to focus on dip and kick nets for all the further analysis. So using dip and kick nets, looking at that, restored had significantly more abundance than the degraded reach. A lot more organisms were captured. For biomass, there wasn't as big of a difference in comparison to the difference in abundance. This was primarily because the majority of the organisms in the degraded reach were large predatory benthic macroinvertebrates, while the majority of those in the restored reach were smaller organisms that can, like lots of snails and lots of organisms that are going to consume find particular organic material. So they're a lot smaller. For general richness, there was also a big difference. So we captured around 23 genera in the restored reach, but in the degraded reach we captured around 11. So there's a big difference there as well. And then looking at diversity, there wasn't a big difference between diversity, however, and again, this is because the dominant organisms within both were present within both communities. It was just there was more overall genera that weren't dominant members of the community within the restored reach that were present there that weren't present within the degraded reach. Looking at functional feeding groups, there was also a big difference. So there's a lot more collectors in the restored reach than the degraded reach. 71% dominant was collectors, while only 26 collectors in the degraded reach. 19% were scrapers, while this was the dominant members of the community functional feeding groups within the degraded reach, so 53%. For predators, there was a lot more predators in the degraded reach, 70%, as I said, than the restored reach, only 7%. And these were primarily non-biting leeches, while these were mainly dragonfly larvae. And shredders, less than 1% in the restored reach, well, there was 4% shredders in the degraded reach. So there's a big difference in the types of functional feeding groups that these organisms are taking up within both reaches as well. Looking at the results from the HBI and CPMI, then the Hilsenhoff Biotic Index and the Coastal Plain Macroinvertebrate Index, Lucas Creek, it had 20 total taxa versus 10 here. For EPT taxa, there was 0 Ephemeroptera, Polycoptera, or Trichoptera within either stream reach, which again are tolerant organisms. Percent of Ephemeroptera is 0. HBMI was scored, so this is 7.94 versus 7.45. And the percent clingers, there was only 1.7 versus 5.56. So overall, all of these values were too low to give a score. So the only category that actually received a score on this assessment was the total taxa. And so the taxa here received a 6, which is the highest you can get because it had a lot of taxa. Here it received a 2 because it only had 10. So the HBI for the restored reach here is indicative of poor water quality under very significant organic pollution, while the degraded reach here is indicative of fairly poor water quality under significant organic pollution. So it was actually more organic pollution. The community was indicative of more organic pollution in the restored reach than the degraded reach. However, when you grade them, when you factor in the total amount of taxa present within both reach, assessing the biotic community, as I said, there was a 0 in every category except for total taxa. The restored reach got, the biotic community was indicative of 1 under stress, while the degraded reach was 1 under severe stress. So actually the biotic community itself, factoring in all of the different metrics, was actually indicative of 1 under less stress in the restored reach than the degraded because there was so much more taxa there. Looking at the statistical analyses, sectional diversity actually did not vary significantly between reaches. Sectional biomass didn't vary significantly between reaches or richness. And the primary reason this is although you had these really big differences between restored and degraded reaches for all of this, for this community, there was a lot of variation reach to reach, or section to section. And so not every pool in the restored reach had greater diversity or abundance or biomass than a pool in the degraded reach. Overall, using a composite sample from all of the reaches that we sampled, there was much more there, much more diversity, richness, biomass, abundance in the restored reach than the degraded, but section to section, the variation was significant. So that being said, we tried to look at, okay, well, what factors then are present within the restored and degraded reaches? What differences are there that are contributing to the difference that we can see? So benthic macroinvertebrate richness was determined to have a significant negative relationship with distance running from the top of the stream to the bottom, which you can see here. So distance in meters, plot general richness, and then general richness was also found to have a significant positive correlation with average plot substrate particle size. So as substrate particle size increased, so did the richness of the organisms found there. However, there was a significant and highly substantial negative correlation found between distance down the reach and average substrate particle size seen here. So as you worked your way down the reach, substrate particle size decreased. And so because there was such a strong relationship between substrate particle size and general richness, and that's been supported by literature as well, it was concluded that the trend you saw with decreasing richness as you worked your way down the reach was most likely not due to the fact that it was some factor, most likely not because of the distance that you were traveling, but more because as you worked your way down the reach, substrate particle size decreased, and that was mainly correlated with that richness. So that being said, although substantial differences in benthos communities were present between reaches in abundance, richness, diversity, and biomass, there was a lot of sectional variability causing it to be insignificant when looking section to section. Richness was positively correlated with substrate particle size, as I said, And then both reaches biotic communities, however, were indicative of poor to fairly poor water quality under both stress and severe stress for the biotic community. However, this is really common for urban benthos communities where there's a lot of pollution entering these environments. So that's the end of the benthic macroinvertebrate portion. Now the final portion of the experiment, which is the nutrient portion of the experiment. Looking at that, we used a nutrient salt addition method. This is an instantaneous slug addition method. And the idea is all of this experimentation took place under dry weather conditions, so no rain within 48 hours. And then preliminary background samples were taken from each of the stream reaches the day of experimentation and tested for chloride, nitrate, and phosphate, which were the three nutrient forms that we were interested in. The nutrient slug addition method that we use, the idea is you have a large jug, and you have two large jugs. One you fill with a certain amount of nutrients, of nitrate and phosphate, and then the other one you fill with sodium chloride, with salt. You bring that to the site, you fill it up with water, you mix it up fully, and then you pour it in. And as it works its way down the stream, you then have, so before I get to that, for the NaCl, the salt, we added between 3 to 4 kilograms, and for the nitrate phosphate, we added 0.3 to 1 kilogram. So as it works its way down the stream, a sonde was used to monitor changing conductivity. So at the bottom of the reach, you pour it at the top, it works its way down, it passes your sonde at the bottom, which you can see here, and a data logger, and we're going to see this change in conductivity. That change in conductivity looks like this. It's going to shoot up and then fall back down. And this curve is known as a BTC, or breakthrough curve, and that's important to know because I'm going to say BTC for the remainder of the PowerPoint. 0 being when it actually got to us. So this would take, it could take anywhere between 4 to 5 hours for it actually to get to us, and then, and then 2 hours to pass, and then that would be the end of the day. But so 0 being when it actually got to us and we started registering this change in conductivity. The whole time that this is changing, background grab samples were taken as that conductivity rose and fell. So pretty quickly right at the beginning, even quicker right at the curve to get that peak, and then slower as it worked its way down. So we changed in frequency. And the idea is each one of those samples are going to have what we put in at the top after uptake has occurred and after dilution has occurred. And so we wanted to use each one of those samples and test them to create other breakthrough curves of nutrients and chloride to see how much of what we added in was retained at the bottom, adjusting for dilution based off of chloride. Because your chloride is going to get diluted but not actively processed by the stream, while your nutrients are going to be taken up much more quickly, and so you're going to have uptake on that, and it's a conservative tracer, non-uptake on your chloride. So for sample analysis, all of those samples were then vacuum filtered through a 0.45 micrometer millipore filter, and then nutrient analyses were conducted using an auto-analyzer system. Basically, you set up all the chemistry, it flows through, and then it mixes chemicals actively, and you get a reading through a colorimeter at the end on the computer screen. Nitrate and phosphate was analyzed within 48 hours, and chloride was analyzed within 4 months, and all of the samples were frozen prior to those analyses occurring. So in the end, when you end up with all these samples that have been tested and run, you end up with curves like this. So in this case, orange here is phosphate, and blue here is nitrate. So I don't exactly remember with Stony Run, this is nutrient concentration in ppm, but say we added the same amount at the top of the reach, those curves would normally be up here, but as it worked its way down to the bottom of the reach, now we have much more phosphate than we have nitrate, indicating that there was more nitrate uptake than there was phosphate in this particular reach. And by integrating the area underneath each one of these curves, you can then calculate the amount of tracer that you recover at the end and compare it to what you put in at the beginning. Using that data for the chloride, we calculated discharge, or Q. Discharge is the width and depth of the water traveling per unit time. So the way we did this is that injected chloride we used to create a BTC within those samples to calculate tracer mass recovery. Basically, you have the amount you added in milligrams divided by this integrated background corrected tracer concentrations that you collected at the end. And so you end up with milligrams per liter, and then you multiply that per unit time each time, so you're integrating that area underneath. So essentially it's the mass you had at the beginning divided by that underneath, and then you end up with 1 over a minute per liter, or liters per minute in the end. So volume of water traveling per unit time. We then calculated tracer mass recovery for each of the nutrients. And so TMR, basically you have your Q, so this is your discharge in liters per minute. You multiply that by the integrated tracer concentrations that you have. So this is milligrams per liter, and then that's multiplied per unit time, changing time, so it's minutes. So milligrams minute per liter. This breaks down to milligrams. So you have milligrams that you collect at the end that you can compare to the beginning. This is also then further used to calculate the percent tracer recovery and used in all for just spiraling metrics. It's important to know. So the first spiraling metric that I presented at the beginning, the uptake length, again, is the average distance that those nutrient molecules are traveling before being processed by the stream. The way that we calculated this is by plotting. So x here is, just going to go to that. So the x-axis here is distance, going from the top of the reach where we put it in to the bottom of the reach where we collect it. And then you have the natural log of nutrient to chloride ratio. So you have a natural log of nitrate to phosphate, and then, nitrate to chloride within your samples versus what you added in, that ratio. And so the natural log of that ratio, the idea is as it works its way down, that ratio is going to become more negative because it's the natural log. The slope of this line is known as the BTC, integrated longitudinal uptake rate, or KW. The only important thing to know about that is that if you take the negative inverse of that, it's equal to uptake length in meters. The next thing we calculated was calculating the geometric mean of observed and conservative tracer concentrations, or NC. This is the average concentration between the BTC of tracers that we collected at the end and that of a BTC that would have been created if no uptake were to occur, only dilution. And the way that you kind of calculate that is you have liters per minute, so your discharge, multiplied by your observed concentrations times unit time, so milligrams minutes per liter. This is going to break down to milligrams. So you have milligrams that you collected total at the end, so that's the integrated area. And then you're dividing by that by the integrated Q times unit time, so your sampling that occurred. And so this breaks down to a volume of water. So you're basically dividing the total amount that you got that you collected at the end, divided by the amount of water that passed during your collection. By incorporating those two things, you have a milligrams per liter. You multiply that by the conservative tracer concentrations, and the way you calculate that is, so you have a ratio of the amount you've added in between your nutrient and your chloride. Using that ratio, you can calculate, based off of the chloride concentrations that you at the end, what the nitrate would have been if there was no uptake that would have occurred. So you get a second BTC that you estimate that basically a hypothetical one if no uptake were to occur. So you do the same exact techniques for this, and you end up with milligrams that you collected at the end of tracer if no uptake were to occur, divided by the volume. You multiply those two, milligrams squared per liter squared, square root milligrams per liter. You end up with an average concentration of those two. And it provides, again, an approximation of the nutrient concentration experienced across the stream reach during the study. Using that information, you calculate uptake rate, which is U. So this is the rate at which nutrient ions are being removed from the water column once again. And then the way that you calculate this is by multiplying discharge by that geometric mean that we just talked about, and then dividing that by the uptake length times width. And so what you end up with is your liters per minute in discharge times milligrams per liter, divide that by meters times meters, so you end up with milligrams per minute per meter squared. So this is the amount that's being taken up per minute per unit per area. And then using that, you can then calculate uptake velocity, which again is the vertical speed at which nutrients are traveling towards Benthic. So the way you calculate that is you have your uptake, milligrams per meter squared per minute, divided by milligrams per liter, your geometric mean. It breaks down to liters per meter squared times minute. If you divide that by 1,000, you convert liters to meters cubed. And then that then breaks down meters cubed and meters squared to meters per minute. You multiply that times 1,000 and it's millimeters per minute. So basically, because you divide it by 1,000 and then multiply by 1,000, liters per meter squared per minute is actually equatable to millimeters per minute for velocity. So some of the results of the nutrient portion of this experiment. For discharge, it was around 1,250 liters per minute in discharge for Stony Run. This is the biggest site. And then for the degraded reach, it was closer to 1,000, so there was a difference between restored and degraded reaches for discharge. For Highlands, restored and degraded reaches, again, a difference closer to 400 liters per minute, about almost 200 liters per minute in the degraded reach, so again, that same difference. However, Lucas Creek is around 2,000 liters per minute, so a huge difference, and then the degraded reach was over 8,000. We talked about this for a long time, and basically what we came to the conclusion is that although sampling didn't occur for 48 hours, this was the first site that was sampled over the summer, and there was a lot of rain around that time. And so when visiting the site and doing the sampling, it was dry weather conditions within 48 hours, but we think rain might have been the cause of all of this. So a drastic increase. So that is a source of error for the experiment, in that discharge is factored in with a lot of that nutrient processing. So for results, for background nutrient concentrations, I'm not going to go over this as much, but basically the important note is that there's a lot lower phosphate than there is nitrate, as was to be expected. However, some important notes is there's a lot of chloride in Stony Run, really high chloride. This is indicative of, well, we think it might be because there's a pipe running through the top of the reach that might be contributing to that. We're uncertain if that's like a wastewater pipe or what that is, but there's a lot of chloride in the water. That's the only thing we can think of. For Highlands Restored, you can see regular levels of phosphate, but there's really high nitrate here, much higher than any of the other sites, much higher than you were to expect in the stream here. And the reason this might be is because there's a lot of seeps entering the stream and lots of algal growth all over the place. So we already anticipated that this is probably because of nitrate from nutrient enrichment from the surrounding environment. But we weren't entirely sure. But looking at this data, it definitely seems as though there's a lot of nutrient enrichment coming out of those seeps that are contributing to the amount of nitrate within the stream. There's also pretty high background chloride concentrations. Looking at Lucas Creek, this is a little bit more normal, although pretty dilute with a lot of the nutrient forms. This is most likely because we had such high discharge, there was probably just a lot of water in the system. So again, most likely because of that influence of weather conditions prior to those 48 hours. Looking at nutrient recovery, I'm not going to talk about this as much, but basically this is the amount that we injected in, the amount we recovered for each of these. And obviously there's a lot less when we inject than we recover at the end because of nutrient uptake to occur. It's more clear if we convert this to graphs. So looking at nitrate phosphate uptake, slightly higher percentage recovery in nitrate in the restored reach, so green is the restored, always in this experiment, in this presentation rather. In the degraded, slightly lower percentage retention, restored slightly higher, slightly lower. In Highlands, you have slightly lower retention of nitrate than in the degraded reach, and almost equal of phosphate. When you look at Lucas Creek, slightly higher retention of nitrate in the restored reach than the degraded reach, and same for phosphate. However, you can tell it's kind of hard to sense differences in this, and this is why nutrient spiraling estimates are used, because if you just were to look at this percent retention, this is not accounting for differences in distance, differences in area, discharge. It's not accounting for a lot of these values, and it's very hard to compare value to value. And so that's why we use all of this data to estimate spiraling metrics, because they're a lot clearer and better for comparisons. So looking at nutrient uptake lengths, for Stony Run, nitrate was higher uptake lengths, and so this is kind of counterintuitive. If you have longer uptake lengths, that means nutrients are traveling further before being processed by the stream. So it's actually, in this case, larger uptake lengths is worse than shorter uptake lengths, because it indicates that the stream is not processing as quickly. So in this case, nitrate uptake lengths were longer in the restored reach than the degraded, so there's less uptake for uptake length. For phosphate, it was the same story for Stony Run. For Highlands, there was slightly higher uptake lengths, so again, lower uptake for nitrate. For phosphate, there was lower uptake lengths in the restored reach than the degraded, so indicating more phosphate uptake in Highlands. And then looking at Lucas Creek, you had lower uptake of nitrate in the restored reach than the degraded reach, or lower uptake length, so more uptake of nitrate and phosphate here. So that's just looking at uptake length. When you look at uptake rate, a slightly different story emerges. So you have, this is now what you would think, so greater uptake rates, more uptake. Nitrate uptake is lower here in the restored reach than the degraded, and for phosphate as well. So overall, Stony Run, although there wasn't a huge difference in uptake rates, lower in the restored reach than the degraded. In highlands, virtually equal for nitrate for uptake rate. And for phosphate, there was significantly higher uptake of phosphate in the restored reach than the degraded reach. Looking at Lucas Creek, it's different than the uptake lengths in that the restored reach is actually processing the nutrient at a lower rate than the degraded reach. Looking at uptake velocities, virtually equal in Stony Run between restored and degraded reaches. There was almost no difference in uptake velocities. And for highlands, there was a slight difference in nitrate, slightly higher, but again, pretty similar. But there was a huge difference, much higher uptake velocities in highlands for phosphate than for nitrate. When looking at Lucas Creek, again, just like with rate and opposite of length, uptake velocities were lower in the restored reach than the degraded reach for both nitrate and phosphate. And so, kind of interpreting that data, that being said, Lucas Creek had shorter uptake lengths for nitrate and phosphate, which would have been indicative of greater uptake for the system. However, this may be due to higher flow velocities within the degraded reach. So there's been a lot of literature that basically states that if you have really high discharge moving through your system, it's pushing nutrients farther and keeping them from being sequestered by and taken up by the system. So your uptake lengths with higher discharge are going to be longer. This kind of makes sense because if you look at uptake length, it was indicative of better, for more uptake, but for velocity and rate, it was indicative of lower uptake in the restored reach. So most likely this is because of the discharge. It's not actually indicative of greater uptake within the system in the restored reach than the degraded. When looking at Stony Run, it had similar uptake in both the restored and degraded reaches for length, rate, and velocity. This is primarily because, again, the focus of the project was not to engineer a lot of that channel complexity that's going to force a lot of the hyperetic exchange. A lot of the sediment organics are going to get trapped downstream without that. And also, it's a brand new site. And so it was recently constructed. There's probably not a whole lot of stabilization there, and a lot of those bacterial communities haven't established themselves yet. So naturally, lower uptakes in general. Looking at highlands, this is really where you get to see something that's a little bit different. Highlands had greater uptake within the restored reach compared to the degraded for phosphate, but negligible differences in nitrate for both length, rate, and velocity. Now, the reason we think this is because if you can remember, there were really high nitrate background nutrient conditions, really high background nitrate concentrations. We think that's from seeps entering. And you can see from this photo, this is a seep coming out of the side here, and this is the algal growth on the side. So really dense, really thick algae on the side of the bank here. And you can see even in the water here, all of the rocks are completely coated in algae. This is most likely because of how high the nitrate concentrations are within the stream. But if you remember, also for growth for vegetation, this is the stream running through here. You just can't see it. There's just tons and tons of vegetation throughout that area. And most likely this is because of the enrichment from that nitrate. However, if you remember from phosphate, it was well within the estimation for normal background concentrations for phosphate. So most likely the reason why this is because that nitrate is forcing phosphate into almost a limiting nutrient for the system. Because you have such low phosphate concentrations and such high nitrate concentrations, all this algal growth and vegetation, it needs more phosphate. And so when we added phosphate into the system, you had this huge shot up of uptake in phosphate, but not a whole lot of difference in nitrate uptake because the system was already saturated with nitrate. So all this things are just said. So in conclusion, a lot of the phosphate uptake, where the phosphate uptake was greater in the restored reach of highlands compared to the degraded, this is likely due to a combination of those background nutrient concentrations, but it also may be due to the fact there's such a huge difference in channel complexity. So we're uncertain if those same high nutrient concentrations weren't there, if nitrate uptake would be higher or lower. We're not entirely sure, but there is a huge difference in channel complexity between restored and degraded reaches. And also primarily because of a lot of that primary productivity, like we talked about, the algae and plant growth. All other restored reaches had equal to lower inorganic nutrient uptake compared to the degraded reaches. And so dew restorations designed to trap organics and sediment also have enhanced dissolved inorganic nutrient uptake. It's kind of inconclusive because Stony Run is such a new site and it wasn't really engineered to really force a lot of hyperheatic exchange. we're uncertain if that is really a good representation or very indicative of whether or not these techniques force more nutrient uptake. And so really the comparison is between Lucas Creek and Highlands, but Lucas Creek also may have been influenced by the really high flow velocities, so we're uncertain about whether or not that might have skewed the data slightly. But so all we can kind of conclude certainly is that the phosphate uptake was in fact higher in the restored reach of Lucas Creek or of Highlands than the degraded reach. Looking at benthic macroinvertebrates, again, benthic macroinvertebrate communities had greater abundance, richness, diversity, and biomass in the restored reach compared to the degraded when looking the whole reach compared to the whole degraded reach. But looking section to section, every section did not have that same effect compared to the degraded reach. Benthos richness was significantly correlated with substrate particle sizes, which were much larger in the restored reach. And so based off of that, do restorations designed to trap organics and sediment also enhance benthic macroinvertebrate abundance, richness, diversity, and biomass? Potentially, because of those larger substrate particle sizes, increased habitat heterogeneity are subsequently influencing clearly a lot of that benthic macroinvertebrate community abundance and richness and diversity. However, although that being said, there was they were indicative of lesser water quality, a little bit more pollution, organic pollution, and this is most likely just because we're in an urban environment and there's going to be a lot of pollution entering the stream. So some of the confounding variables for the research, reach positioning, I didn't talk about this. Stony Run, the degraded reach was above the restored reach, and so a lot of the water that's entering these systems are primarily entering through culverts, and generally the reach that's at the top of the stream is going to experience a lot more of those high flow velocities right off the bat and become more degraded over time. So reach positioning really was something that we didn't really account for, although two of the other sites, Highlands and Lucas Creek, were restored reach then degraded reach. In addition, that same reach positioning concept, the degraded reach is not a perfect comparison pre-restoration. So that was the best we could do because we didn't have pre-restoration uptake data. But if you had a restored reach with a culvert feeding right into it, one would think that those high flow velocities coming off of that and degrading the restored reach, now restored reach, would have caused that system to become even more degraded than the downstream system pre-restoration. So although we can say, oh, it's slightly higher, now because of the restored reach, it's not a perfect comparison. If anything, the values for the degraded reach are actually better for uptake than they would have been pre-restoration. Observational analyses supported by primary literature is another thing. A lot of this was based off of, we can see a lot of algal growth. We know empirically what the background concentrations are, but we're kind of supporting a lot of this interpretation based off of primary literature, which is to be expected. But again, we couldn't test for everything. Equations to calculate averages of averages, the average width to calculate the average uptake length. And although these techniques are supported by primary literature and have been used again and again to calculate spiraling metrics, there is some error associated with that. If you have drastic differences in temperature and discharge, if you have higher flow velocities after a rainstorm, all of these values are going to be different. So this is really just a snapshot on a dry weather conditions under average temperature conditions during the summer. So looking at future research, it would be interesting to study other spiraling aspects. As I talked about at the beginning, particulate uptake length, consumptive uptake length, transient storage, all of these factors that are also incorporated into spiraling, interesting to look at. Looking at uptake lengths across age gradients, this was the original purpose of this project, but we didn't get enough replicability to be able to look at all of these across multiple age gradients because every stream is so different from every other one, and it's not a one-size-fits-all for stream restoration. And so you really need a lot of stream sites and a lot of data to be able to look at age gradients and find any sort of significant trends. It would also be interesting to look at particulate and sediment retention, since that was kind of how these techniques are designed, what these techniques are designed to do. And then also look at the effect of riparian vegetation on high flow nutrient retention. So a lot of times there's a lot done on the banks to try to help establish vegetation, some artificial wetland stuff occasionally on the side, and it'll be interesting to see how all of that is influencing nutrient uptake under higher flow regimes.